framework?
Just really quickly, thank you, Tracy. I would like to point out just quickly that when Tracy talks about this regulatory structure here, what we're focusing on today is obviously the management plans. So what this proposal is focusing on is a little bit limited in scope based on kind of the authority and the scope of the management plans. So there's certainly other recharge topics that could be discussed, but what this particular forum is really focusing on is that 5th management plan scope. Thanks.
So management plans. When we're talking about management plans, the primary focus is typically safe yields, that AMA balancing between inputs and outputs. And there isn't as much emphasis put on addressing local conditions. However, recharge can be a very helpful water management tool when addressing local water supply problems or local water level problems. And so back in the 3rd management plan and continuing on into the 4th management plan, the recharge program and the department developed storage and recovery siting criteria to help address these local conditions within the AMAs. And in addition, if you actually look at the storage and recovery siting criteria, you see that the recovery requirements are actually set in place relative to where storage occurs. And so actually you can kind of think of this as a first attempt to address this concept of hydrologic disconnect that is being discussed in other forums. However, there is one siting criteria in the management plan involving storage and recovery in areas of shallow depths to water that is not being administered by the department. And that requirement states that if an entity is recharging in an area determined by the director to be experiencing shallow depths to water conditions, the recovery will be the entity will be required to recover that water within the area of impact of the facility only. The department is proposing to include that language, to continue to include that language in the 5MP and to begin enforcing it when the 5MP becomes effective. However, it is important to note that the department is also proposing that this would only apply to any new USF or any existing USF that is modified or renewed after the 5MP becomes effective. And so that's an important piece that I want to emphasize again, that this would not affect the existing long-term storage credits as the department has it proposed right now. It would only apply to water stored at a new USF or an existing USF that is modified or renewed after the 5MP takes effect, and if that facility is deemed to be subject to that requirement. So in order to implement this requirement, the department actually has to make 2 determinations. The first determination is, where are these areas of shallow depths to water? What criteria would we use to define those areas? And the department for this piece is looking to solicit input and feedback from stakeholders as we work on developing these criteria. The second piece of that requirement requires the department to determine which entities are then recharging in these shallow depths to water areas. And the department's proposal is to use the maximum area of impact that's submitted as part of USF applications and take that maximum area of impact and compare it to these director-determined areas of shallow depths to water. If the maximum area of impact of a facility overlaps these director-determined areas of shallow depths to water, then that facility would be determined to be recharging in an area of experiencing shallow depths to water conditions and would be subject to this management plan requirement. So now I'm going to move on to the second piece of the proposal, and that primarily involves some new language that the department is planning to include that deals with recovery in these director-determined areas of shallow depths to water. And there are 3 components to this part of the proposal. The first deals with permitting of recovery wells. And the department is proposing that permitting of recovery wells that are located within a director-determined area of these shallow depths to water would be deemed consistent with the management plan. Functionally, what that means is that there would be no 100-year depth to water or 4-foot decline requirement. The second component of this portion of the proposal deals with recovery from within a director-determined area of shallow depths to water. If an entity recovers water from a permitted recovery well within this area, that activity would be deemed consistent with the management plan. Functionally, what that means is that there would be no ongoing 4-foot decline requirement. And then the last component actually is a component that allows entities who are deemed to be recharging in a director-determined area of shallow depths to water to also take advantage of the concepts discussed in the previous 2 bullets. So at a high level, what does this mean? What does this proposal mean for recharge and recovery? First, what it means is that if the proposal is implemented, water stored at facilities that are determined to impact areas of director-designated shallow depths to water could only be recovered within either the facility's AOI, or which is defined as the 1-mile safe harbor, or the area of hydrologic impact. The second place where they would be able to recover are these designated shallow depths to water areas. Recovery of stored water at such facilities would be prohibited outside of either of these areas. The proposal also makes it easier for permitting of recovery wells for entities who choose to recover water from within a designated shallow depths to water area. And that's because there would be no 100-year depths to water or 4-foot decline requirement. And lastly, water stored anywhere within a Phoenix AMA could be recovered from a permitted recovery well that is located within the designated shallow depths to water area and would be considered consistent with the management plan. And that's because there would be no ongoing 4-foot decline requirement. So I know I presented a lot of information and I presented it kind of at breakneck speed. I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time for people to ask the questions they have, get any clarifications about the proposal they may need. So in the next 2 slides, I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to open up a meeting for discussion and questions at this point. These 2 slides have the main points of each of the proposals, and we can move through the slides as need be when people have questions about the different parts of the proposal.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. So what you can see on the screen is really just intended to be a quick summary overview to help us as we talk through any discussion that we're going to have here today. I'm not seeing any questions or comments in the chat yet. Oh, just kidding, one came in just now. But I would also like to point out, I know Tracy mentioned this briefly, the proposal as written is focused on the Phoenix AMA. Our intent at this time is to only include this for the Phoenix AMA. So we're certainly looking for feedback on that and on the various other items that Tracy talked through. So I have one question here in the chat from Michelle Van Quatham, who says, would the shallow depth areas potentially include areas that are subflow/surface water? How would the department address that issue? And I think I'll have Kelly take that question.
Sure. With regard to that concept, the department will continue to operate as it has in the past across all programs, and will continue to take the view that if it is water that's deemed subflow that's pumped from a well, that would be groundwater, and if it's in other areas, it would be surface water. And the department would continue to operate in that fashion, absent some determination from an adjudication court or a statutory change, but we wouldn't act preemptively at this point from our current view or stance, absent something like that happen from the adjudication court or statutory change.
Okay. Thanks, Kelly. The next question I see here is, how often would the shallow depths to water be reevaluated? That's from Krista McJunkin.
That's a part of the piece that we're still talking about and soliciting input on. That is a topic that we would like to get people's thoughts on, because we're still trying to decide what criteria we would use to not only define these areas, but then administer that requirement.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. The next question we have here is from Drew Shukowski. I apologize, Drew, if I butchered your last name there. Drew says, could the AOI also include a hydrologic modeled area along with the safe harbor?
Yes. So the recovery for that water, per the department's requirement, the department's definition and interpretation, involves both the 1 mile safe harbor and an area of hydrologic impact around the storage facility.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here because we had a follow-up to Drew's comment from Lauren Hickson. Since the max AOI determines the impact to shallow groundwater areas, it seems that this should also apply to the areas where recovery is allowed.
That is something that we definitely could talk about. It is the department's proposal to use the maximum area of impact and then to limit recovery to within the 1 mile safe harbor or AOHI. I would like to note that there are actually several different definitions of area of impact, and so it really depends on the application or the permit in which it's being applied to, and so we definitely could consider that.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Next question is from Doug Dunham. Why the Phoenix AMA only?
That's a great question, Doug. We're still trying to figure out if this is valuable as a an additional water management tool. There are a lot of questions, as people have indicated, how it would be applied, how it would be interpreted, how it would be administered. And so I feel like maybe the department wasn't ready to jump in with both feet, that we wanted to use this as an opportunity to see if this was something that could be valuable to people within the Phoenix AMA first.
And maybe to add a little bit to that, I think depending on how some of those definitions that we still need to detail were to be established, perhaps there could be opportunity for it to be applied to other AMAs as well. We're certainly looking for feedback on that. Thanks, Doug. Next question is from Tom Harbour. Does ADWR have a straw man proposal of what depth to water would be considered to be shallow? And Tracy or Jeff, I'm not sure if one of you want to take that, or I can take a stab at that.
Well, I'll take this. Jeff Inwood. Tom, we don't have anything developed at this point in time, but obviously we've had some discussions about that, and that's part of why we're seeking some input to get a broader range of thoughts on what is shallow in a arid environment such as Arizona versus back east or places where groundwater levels are much higher. So don't have anything definitive at this point. Again, have discussed it, but looking for input from others like yourself.
Thanks, Jeff. From Carlene Martirana, are there any changes to how recharging or recovery at a GSF would work?
No, this would not involve a GSF.
Okay, easy answer. I like that. Good. All right. Mark Holmes says, what is the criteria for shallow depth to water, i.e. feet below land surface?
Just what Jeff said.
Yeah. We haven't determined yet. Excuse me. We're working on it and would like help.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So part of this meeting and also part of the questionnaire that McKenna provided a link to in the chat and also in the presentation is seeking feedback on precisely that. So we would hope that you all would kind of consider this, take some time, or if you have initial ideas today, that would be great as well. But we have lots of ways that you can consider this and provide feedback on exactly that question of how should we or could we define that in order to make this kind of a functional policy. So great, thank you. Krista McJunkin says, are the facility permittees required to prove the AOI? Krista, you can feel free to unmute yourself if that's helpful. I'm not sure if we quite know what you mean by that.
What I mean is that right now there's a presumptive area of impact, the safe harbor, but under this, is that something that's part of the application process where they'd have to prove this area of shallow groundwater, or is it something the department would do?
So the first piece is defining which entities are going to be subject to this requirement. And as we mentioned before, that would be based on the maximum AOI that's part of a USF. For the purposes of then limiting the recovery to the AOI of the facility, the department interprets that AOI as actually two things, the 1 mile safe harbor around the USF or this concept of area of hydrologic impact. Both of those are available currently today as well as under this proposal for the purposes of recovery of any credits actually.
Okay.
And then the part about, she had a second part.
The question was just, are facility permittees required to prove the AOI?
Oh, and I think she asked who is going to prove the shallow or determine the shallow groundwater, depth to water conditions.
So that would be, the way the management plan language is currently written is that it's a director-determined area. So we would solicit, that's why we're soliciting input, is because we have to determine what those conditions are, where those areas are, and in what frequency that determination would be made as well. It's a fairly large task.
Krista also had another question here. What's the difference between shallow groundwater areas and waterlogged areas?
Well, so waterlogged area doesn't have an exact definition of depth to water. It relates to the exemptions that are provided to the irrigation districts. And while in our discussions we have talked about how shallow depth to water levels are related to waterlogged areas, they're not necessarily the same, but they're in my mind, a waterlogged area could be a shallow depth of water area, but a shallow depth of water area might include areas that aren't necessarily waterlogged, or specifically the Buckeye waterlogged area. So we have not, again, until we determine what a shallow depth of water area is, we can't tie it to a waterlogged area of any kind. But once we determine what the shallow depth of water levels are, that may tie in with waterlogged areas to some degree, somehow.
Thanks, Jeff. Terry Sue Rossi says, is ADWR already aware of existing facilities that fall within areas experiencing shallow groundwater levels, or shallow water levels, excuse me?
I think, once again, that totally depends on how entities, the department, other entities want to consider what is a shallow depth to water. And so I guess I don't really have a great answer for that. We just talked about the Buckeye waterlogged area, which could have shallow water levels and vice versa. But I think it really would be instructive once we start getting some feedback and developing some ideas on criteria for these shallow water levels, to maybe put together, based on different ideas for it, what areas that would involve, to give people a little bit more concrete information. But right now, I would say, because we don't really have any kind of idea of how we want to define those shallow water level areas, that I wouldn't hazard a guess, I guess.
Patrick Adams says, has ADWR considered using another indicator for overlap with a shallow groundwater area other than maximum AOI? What about the AOHI?
The AOHI is, by its definition, the area of hydrologic impact is what is calculated once you know how much water is in the ground at a facility, so you know what the actual hydrologic impact is at that facility. In order to permit a facility and determine if, when that water is put into the ground at that facility into the future, if that water could be in an area that it has a shallow depth to water, we have to look forward in the model, use a predictive model. And so you have to assume certain conditions to permit those facilities and make that determination. The AOHI is based on historic information and used for recovery.
Thanks, Tracy. From the Arizona Water Banking Authority, to confirm, this proposal would only apply to the recovery of long-term storage credits accrued after the 5MP takes effect?
That is correct.
Good.
And also, I do want to emphasize again that it only is if entities do come in after the 5MP is effective and are then determined subject to the requirement at that time. If someone has a permit right now and that facility continues to operate after the 5MP becomes effective, those credits stored at that facility, even if they would have been potentially recharging in an area of shallow groundwater, those credits would not be subject to that restriction unless that entity then comes in to modify or renew that existing facility.
Right, so it would be once the permit is updated after the 5MP takes effect.
Correct.
Okay, perfect. Elizabeth Mora says, how will known areas of perched water be woven into the newly defined shallow depth to water area definition?
These are all really good questions. I think one of the things that we had talked about is looking at a bunch of different features, as well as possibly how long those conditions persist potentially. So there's a lot of things that need to factor in, and we definitely would like additional thoughts and questions like that. Do you have anything to add, Jeff?
Well, just that, yeah, if you'd have to have a perch zone that is going to be pretty close to land surface, right. You know, if you have if it's 100-foot depth to the top of the perch zone and it comes up 10 feet, that's probably not going to qualify as shallow. But yeah, obviously, if there are shallow perch zones, that would take into effect. The one thing I'll point out is that we're looking at this to give some people some idea of what we want back, is we need to base this on verifiable data and information. We can't just assume something and say that will qualify as shallow. We've talked about this needing hard data or something reported to the department, something that can be defensible and relied upon. And so if you have a perch zone and the water levels in a well show that, then you know that would qualify in my mind. But if we're basing it on the water level itself.
Right.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Lauren Hickson says, another comment about the maximum AOI. It seems that this area tends to be very large, almost AMA wide, which seems to be an issue that needs to be addressed addressed with USF modeling/permitting in general?
I would say that as part of this 5MP process, the program is taking this particular opportunity to look back on all of the, decades that the program has been operating, to see where there are successes and where there are improvements, where we can streamline permitting. And I feel that that definitely is a topic that the program could consider and look into. So appreciate the feedback on that. We feel like there is a lot of information, historic information on facilities and how they've been permitted, how they've actually operated, that we feel can inform maybe improvements to the recharge program. That's not necessarily this forum, but your particular issue is one that is an astute observation.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. D. Corrich says, since USFs already have operational prohibitions related to water level impacts, what problem will this proposal solve?
This proposal isn't to address unreasonable harm or really even hydrologic feasibility when it comes to permitting of a USF. The first part of the proposal basically kind of addresses that if there are facilities that are recharging in an area where water levels are very shallow, that it makes good hydrologic and water management sense to have that recovery be in that same area. It doesn't make a lot of hydrologic sense to recharge in an area where water levels are shallow and recover that water someplace else. And so they're actually kind of two separate things, even though they involve the permitting of USF. It's really more of looking at the process as a whole. Where you put the water in is in areas where there is a potential for hydrologic feasibility issues, that it makes more sense to require that water to be recovered in those areas as well.
Great, thank you. I have a couple questions about the region of direct impact that I'm going to kind of combine here. So from Elizabeth Mora, can you talk about the definition of max AOI and how that compares to the region of direct impact? And Nathan Miller, as a follow-up to Patrick's question, was the region of direct impact considered as an indicator for whether or not a USF impacts an area of shallow groundwater? So definition of max AOI and how that compares to region of direct impact, and whether region of direct impact was considered as an indicator.
So I will say this, the department is actually looking at making a change to how the maximum AOI is defined. This is not something I exactly intended to bring up at this meeting because we don't have the policy completely ready to roll out yet. However, as I alluded to earlier in one of my answers, it is something that we know that people have struggled with. They feel that it's onerous. We wanted to try to make that better and make sure that we could also administer the statutes. And so we are looking at using the region of direct impact, what we're now calling the region of direct impact, solely as the maximum AOI for facilities going forward. And in fact, for applicants that have applications currently pending before us, we've actually told you that. Unfortunately, we just have not gotten the documentation move forward yet on that piece. So we are going to be changing and actually making an improvement in that maximum area of impact calculation as far as it pertains to making applications probably easier, while we still feel we're making this the same statutory requirement we're still administering that same statute equally.
Thanks, Tracy. Terry Sue Rossi says, what is the impetus for the development of this concept? And maybe I'll start on that one. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we had a lot of conversations internally as we were considering our drafting process for the fifth management plans. In that process, our first step there is evaluating the existing language. And in that evaluation, we realized that there were pieces of that we were not fully implementing in the way that we should be. So the first part of this proposal really addresses that piece that we were not fully implementing. How are we going to move forward? How are we going to kind of correct that and actually implement that existing requirement in the management plan? Beyond that, we also, in that evaluation discussion, we also realized that there might be ways to improve upon the existing program, and the fifth management plans might be a reasonable opportunity to address some of the issues that our staff had seen with some of the programs. And maybe Tracy can touch a little bit more on that second piece.
And I feel just from as I've stated before, from a hydrologic standpoint, I don't know if the second piece of the proposal, is something from a water management point of view that would be helpful to stakeholders, but it is something that was something that we at least wanted to put out there and see if that is something that would be advantageous, would be helpful, because like we had said, we're trying to find a way to make the recharge program a bit more streamlined and provide as many water management tools as we can. And we wanted to see if that would be something that people would embrace.
Thanks, Tracy. Terry C. Rossi says, why is the regulatory focus on recovery of water stored in these areas instead of focusing on the permitting of the storage facility to begin with? Surely there is some criteria for issuing facility permit that evaluates whether there is sufficient unsaturated aquifer to accept the permitted volume of water.
There absolutely are. The hydrologic feasibility piece of the USF application is what looks at that. And what I will say is that there is an additional statutory requirement that says even if you can demonstrate that it's not going to cause any unreasonable harm and that it's going to be hydrologically feasible, if any water that you have recharged comes out of storage and or leaves the AMA, that the department has to debit that store's account by the amount that comes out of storage or leaves the AMA. And as you can imagine, that is basically nearly impossible. And so because the statute really is fairly vague about hydrologic feasibility, we really only use land surface as the purpose for the purpose of evaluating hydrologic feasibility. Does water, for the full duration of the permit, fit underground, or would it rise to land surface? It doesn't really talk about there's the potential for that water stored to then migrate to an area that might be dewatered or might come out of storage and flow out of the AMA. We've gotten around that in the past, sometimes by prohibiting recharge in areas where we feel like there's a good likelihood where that could happen. But we don't want to disincentivize recharge. I think we want to find a way to maximize the recharge program and maybe focus recovery a bit more. That's my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for anyone in the program or the department.
Thank you, Tracy. Tom Harbour says, will credits stored prior to 5MP that are later sold by the storer to another entity for recovery after the 5MP retain the ability to recover in areas outside the AOI? Do you want me to repeat that?
Yes.
will credits stored prior to the 5MP that are later sold by the storer to another entity for recovery after the 5MP retain the ability to recover in areas outside the AOI?
Yes. All credits that are stored are assigned a water storage permit number. So we will be tracking water that's stored before, and there'll be an indication in the database that those are credits that 73 was earned under the sort of pre-5MP process. And then after that, when a new facility comes in or that facility is modified or renewed, they would get a different 73 number that has a different 4-digit convention, a different conveyance at the end. And that number would be the indicator, there'd be a database indicator that that number is subject to the 5MP requirement for recovery.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good point that Tracy just made. We do have plans to be able to indicate within our databases when credits are created so that we can track them specifically for these purposes so that there's not any confusion on what those particular credits are eligible for in terms of recovery. Drew says, how will the new ADWR SRV model be used to determine current and future areas of shallow groundwater? With groundwater pumping predicted to increase due to Colorado River cuts, this will have to be monitored very closely. Updates to the model will need to be very timely.
Well, again, since again, we haven't made any determination of how we're going to determine what's shallow, but our discussions have been based on existing data, not necessarily modeling, but again, we haven't made any final determinations on that. So we're looking at we have to put some kind of time frame on it, and we have to come up with some approach and criteria to base it on, and once we do, we'll follow that. And it'll be set up on a regular basis, and we use, that's why I pointed out before, we need real data upon which to base things. Modeling, in my mind, steal Tracy's line, my personal opinion is modeling is not the proper methodology to do this. Too many variables.
So I think what I'm at least hearing here is, and Jeff and Tracy, please jump in and correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, because I'm certainly not the technical expert in the room. I think what I'm hearing is that that definition of shallow groundwater needs to include both the data by which it would be measured. So is that depth to water in surrounding wells? Is that some other measurement? And also some time component of how long have those conditions existed? Is there anything else that I'm missing there?
No, and that's
okay.
What we're kind of looking at it. It's a historical look back versus a projected future analysis, so that, and we've had discussions and we've used, it's not going to be what we're looking at a longer, or how long of a period we need to say so that the conditions are stable, and therefore they would be perceived to be stable in the future. But Drew, you are correct. The more pumping will change the conditions, so that will probably weigh in to some degree about how long we can make the shallow condition timetable out into the future last.
That's a great point.
How frequently that we would reevaluate those conditions for the purposes of administering this requirement.
Okay. Yeah, so I think in terms of specific feedback that we're really looking for, that you all might be able to provide through the questionnaire and other methods, would be kind of those specific things. What types of data should we use there, and what are the timeframes that we should be considering for that definition? Great. Anthony Beckham says, will the department provide an analysis of the existing facilities that will be affected by this proposal once the shallow groundwater levels are defined? For example, when facilities renew or modify their permits?
I don't know that that would be possible because what the department's proposal is for how we would administer that would be to use a new facility or a facility that's going to come in to modify, to use that maximum area of impact that is presented as part of that application process. And that is completely dependent on the features that the applicant asks for, the permitted volume, the size of the facility, the duration of the permit. And so we really wouldn't have any idea of what the maximum area of impact would be for even existing facilities, because they could come in and modify and increase that volume, and that would change their maximum area of impact.
Great. Krista McJunkin says, would the policy only require that long-term storage credits stored at a facility that overlaps the shallow groundwater area be recovered from that area, or would it allow other recovery of credits stored elsewhere to also take place in that area? I can reread that one if you want.
Yes.
Okay. Would the policy only require that long-term storage credits stored at a facility that overlaps a shallow groundwater area be recovered from that area, or would it allow other recovery to take place in that area?
So, if the second piece of the proposal is included in the 5MP, what it allows is that anyone who's stored water anywhere within the Phoenix AMA can get a recovery well permitted in these areas of shallow groundwater, and that recovery and that well would be deemed consistent with the management plan. So you could recover water stored any place else in the AMA within those shallow areas. If an entity is recharging in those areas, they would be able to also recover in these shallow depth to water areas in addition to their facility AOI. Did I answer that question?
I think so.
Did I answer that question, Jeff?
I think so. And, we haven't said this, is we're incentivizing recharge or recovery in the shallow areas regardless of where you store.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. From the Arizona Water Banking Authority, would this proposal have any impact on annual storage and recovery, or only recovery of long-term storage credits?
I would say the first part of the proposal, the existing language does not differentiate between recovery of stored credits or annual storage and recovery, or annual recovery, I guess I should say. And so I would say the first part of the proposal would be both. And I guess I feel, but we hadn't really considered it, that it would also be both annual recovery or recovery of long-term storage credits if you choose to recover your area in a shallow, recover your water in a shallow groundwater area, shallow water level area.
Okay. Terry Sue, and Terry Sue, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to expand on your comment here. I know you wrote quite a bit here. Terry Sue says, the most important aspect of the recharge and recovery program from a water management perspective is the ability to recover those credits, whether you stored the credits or purchased them. Before we create another layer of when and where you can or cannot recover credits, whether existing credits or credits going forward, we need to be sure we are not creating a situation where credits become stranded. That would discourage people from using recharge and recovery as a tool. And Terry Sue, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and expand on any of that.
No, that says what I wanted to say.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Next comment, we have Noel Carter. With DWR maintaining the position that water withdrawn from a well is groundwater, will DWR evaluate the impact of a recovery well through the cone of depression in correlation to the saturated floodplain Holocene alluvium or subflow zone in a perceived shallow groundwater area?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question, but if we don't, because we don't have an adjudication ruling, or in places where we don't have that, take the Salt or Gila River, it doesn't matter what the geologic unit would be that the water is being recovered from. If there's a subflow zone determined per the adjudication court, similar to what's been approved down in San Pedro, then the withdrawals would be subject to the adjudication determination. I don't know if that's answered the question in whole, but I think that's what you were driving at, Noel.
All right. Next here I have Gretchen Irwin. Gretchen says, shallow water or water occurring near the surface tends not to be of the highest quality. Providers generally try to avoid using this type of water due to the expense of treatment, and not everyone has the ability to treat. Would this not defeat the purpose of using this as a management tool, i.e. incentivizing recovery in areas of shallow groundwater and shallow water, excuse me?
I guess that you might know better than I don't, that assumes things that I'm not sure I necessarily would universally agree with, but are potentially possible. I feel like it might potentially have that impact, but I feel like there is a big enough incentive that could be overcome because it would just require treatment of that water. I don't really know. I'm not really sure how to answer that question, Gretchen.
It's an interesting point, Gretchen, and I think our expertise is not on the quality side. So yeah. I think that type of feedback is really helpful if there's more information that you, Gretchen, can provide, or some of the other providers might be able to provide that would help shed some light on that. That would be really helpful.
That could come into play in confined aquifers, that there is significant vertical migration impediment, that you would have shallow groundwater, but you're pumping from a confined aquifer that is not hydrologically connected, and therefore you aren't really recovering the water that's quote unquote near the surface. I haven't considered that, and I don't know how many places that would apply to.
Right.
But it's an interesting point, so thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Great. From Lauren Hickson, Lauren says, Pima County defines shallow groundwater as areas where groundwater is within 50 feet of the land surface. These areas are identified for purposes of protecting riparian areas. I realize this is a different AMA and a different intent, but riparian areas with shallow groundwater should be excluded from this policy. And I think that's an interesting point, Lauren, and something we can certainly consider here. Thank you for that. That's helpful.
What organization has that definition?
With Pima County. The next comment here is from Terry Sue Rossi. How will this proposal work relative to the lower and middle alluvial units? Is the criteria for defining the shallow area a horizontal perspective, like you would define a max AHOI, or is there a vertical dimension? I struggled reading that. Sorry about that. I can reread that one.
Well, the first part of the question is, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's UAU, MAU, or UAU. If it's shallow, it's going to be in the upper alluvial aquifer. I can't imagine, there could be places where the UAU is pinched out and it's MAU, but it doesn't matter what the unit is, it matters where the water is. The question of confined aquifers is adds a little complexity to that, but so the vertical component related to the geologic unit, I don't think is isn't the biggest matter of concern. It's where the water is. I don't know about that. Is there another part to the question that second part was?
Is criteria for defining the shallow area horizontal perspective, or is there a vertical dimension?
Yeah.
So I think the answer there is more horizontal.
Well, there's a horizontal component.
Right, right, exactly. Yep.
Okay, great. Lauren added to her comment from before, additional information on Pima County's definition is that it is in relation to the Pima County Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. They have a GIS map of the areas. Thank you for that additional information, Lauren, that's helpful. Drew says, how would a muni recovery well be permitted outside of their service area? Glendale could not get a well permitted in Buckeye, maybe exchange agreements. So I think this is certainly, I think there's certainly creative exchange agreements or other methods to consider there. Yeah. I don't know that we had specifically laid out the types of strategies that the providers might have with each other. I think that's something that the providers would work out amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd add there, Tracy?
No,
Nicholas Bollock says, in reference to Lauren's question, my opinion is riparian and Sonoran desert habitats linked to historical shallow groundwater should be included as a criteria to not allow recovery of water in the area. Thanks, Nicholas. So that's all the questions I have in the chat for right now. Tracy, maybe we can just go to the next slide. We just wanted to, whoops, sorry, let's try that again.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. We did want to make sure that we had this second piece up on the screen for you all to look at. Again, these slides were intended as just a summary of what Tracy talked through at the beginning of the meeting. We do really appreciate all of the comments and questions and engagement. I think you guys are clearly thinking about this quite a bit and thinking about it really, really critically and thoughtfully. So we're excited to be getting this feedback, be getting some additional information from the stakeholders, and excited to be continuing some of these conversations. I saw an additional question come in from Noel Carter. To follow up on my question, if the Gila River adjudication is completed and these recovery wells are deemed to be withdrawing appropriable subflow, will the permit be withdrawn? Surface water is appurtenant to the land and can only be transferred through a severin transfer, and that is very unlikely to happen.
You know, if the department receives an adjudication indicating that that's how that water is going to be characterized, then that's something that we'd have to discuss. We haven't talked, as I said earlier, we have not talked about changing our strategy absent that, you know, some sort of directive. But I think we would need to talk a little bit about what would happen to ones that were already like that, or if it would just be moving forward. And we haven't discussed that internally, so that's a good point. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Noel. That's a good question. Thanks. All right. I am not seeing any other questions or comments in the chat right now. Is there anyone on the call that would like to unmute themselves and add anything to the questions or comments here? I'll pause for just a moment to give everyone opportunity to do so.
This is Wally Wilson with Metro Water. Just
Hi,
wanted
Wally,
to respond
go ahead.
just to follow up for Drew's question. Metro Water District and the town of Oro Valley and the town of Marana have a 50-year IGA in place now, and that IGA allowed Metro Water to drill 3 production wells in the vicinity of recharge facilities for recovery. So all of, Chandler could drill a recovery well in Buckeye, but it's a local legal agreement between the 2 entities, and it doesn't really come into DWR's realm other than permitting of and the reporting of a recovery well.
Okay, great. Thanks for that insight, Wally. That's helpful. Okay. If there are any other comments or questions, folks are welcome to unmute themselves now.
This is Krista.
Hi, Krista. Go ahead.
So I'm confused about how the service area aspect would work, because I thought the existing recovery well permit required, like you have to meet 3 of, those 3 requirements. And one of them is that the recovery will be within the applicant's service area and that the applicant is a municipal provider. So how do you mesh those 2 together?
I think the way the program envisioned the proposal, and obviously we are open to feedback on this, is that if a recovery well would be put into one of these areas of shallow depth to water, that would essentially look like the same way the management plan requirement is written, is if an entity is recovering within their area of impact at the facility. That if you, right now the management plan says if you recover water within your AOI of where you store the water, you are deemed consistent with the management plan. That would basically, that is the department's proposal with regard to recovering in these areas of shallow depth to water.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Well, that was what Drew was asking.
I see a comment here from Lauren Hickson. It says, did you already address how the shallow areas would be monitored? There should be some monitoring of how quickly these areas are depleted. And maybe slightly related, Nicholas Bollock, if there's risk of subsidence in the area, would recovery wells be permitted? Or maybe those are 2 separate things. We can start with Lauren's about how would shallow areas be monitored?
Well, that's a good point, but we have to have some time frame associated with these, because the program has to be able to track and handle things. So it's not like we can say, oh, we have a new water level, and so now it doesn't meet the criteria, we're going to stop everything. We have to set some time period we can monitor, but I think it's more related to how long of a time period we're going to assign to the shallow water condition. And that's why it's important to get some feedback about, is that X number of years, or is it Y number of years, or is it a decade, or is it, I'm just throwing out numbers, but we can monitor, but we've got to have some fixed time frame associated with it, as we've talked about from a programmatic standpoint.
Okay. So maybe another way to put that is that time frame that we talked about on the shallow groundwater definition kind of has to go both ways, both looking into the past and kind of establishing that time frame for the permit. Okay.
Well, the timeframe for the shallow condition
Yeah.
determination.
Okay, yeah, fair.
And, you know, if we get some feedback and can figure out a way that we can work potentially some kind of monitoring review or something into it, that, I don't know how that would work per se, but
Okay.
yeah, it just cannot be a ad hoc timeframe.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Good question. And then the next question was Nicholas Bollock. If there is a risk of subsidence in the area, would recovery wells be permitted?
I am not a recovery well expert, but I will say that subsidence is evaluated for wells that are permitted as new recovery wells that, as part of their permitting process, they haven't gotten any other authorization to pump out of that well. If it's just a recovery well, that subsidence evaluation is done as part of that review process. Otherwise, I'm not sure when it's done, but it is not done on an ongoing basis, to my knowledge.
Okay. Good. Okay. The next comment here is from the Arizona Water Banking Authority. If recovery restrictions are associated with the USF permit, then it seems the time frame would need to be aligned with the permit expiration.
I think what we had talked about when we were talking about administering this was that the maximum AOI would be used for that facility based on when that facility, you know, got its permit or modified its permit. And then on an ongoing basis, so I'm just going to make up a number here, if we say that the director defines these shallow depth to water areas every 5 years and then reevaluates them again on an ongoing basis every 5 years, then the department would go in and for all those facilities would evaluate using that max AOI against that newly defined shallow depth to water area. And then there may be a time when that permit would not be subject to those restrictions anymore. The shallow depth to water area shrunk or moved or went away, and then the department would have to remove that conditioning, probably actually have to issue a modified permit to remove that condition so that it says that that facility and those water stores are not subject to that requirement.
Good. Thanks, Tracy. From Drew, folks are using water in the Buckeye waterlogged area. How do they feel about a large number of recovery wells in the area? Thanks, Drew. And that's certainly something we are looking for feedback on. We've had some side conversations with some folks already. We're open to having more of those conversations. I think it's important that we do get that type of feedback from folks in the area. We think that this could be a good policy that could be beneficial even to those folks in the area, but we're certainly open to hearing more input on that. Tracy, did you have anything to add there? Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Drew. Riley Hosner, oh, thank you, Riley. Riley put in the chat, Nicholas Bollock, please see R12-15-1303, paragraph B2 in the rules. This is how the department goes about reviewing recovery wells for land subsidence. Thank you so much, Riley.
Thank you, Riley.
Noel Carter says we are not happy about it. Thanks, Noel. Noel, we appreciate that perspective, Noel, and maybe it would be helpful for us to schedule some time to sit down and talk through all of that. We'd be glad to do that. I can reach out to you after this meeting. All right, the Water Banking Authority says, So ADWR would have to actually issue modified permit numbers every time the director changes the shallow water level decision, only to be able to track which credits are subject to the restriction then?
Yes.
Yes. So the way we would do that is using those conveyance numbers, those last 4 digits at the end of the of that permit number. That's something that we do as a pretty standard practice in other programs. It's not something that's a particularly large burden on our side.
And it's unclear, obviously, because we don't have any, criteria or definition of where the shallow depth water areas are, how many facilities and how many stores this would actually affect. That's one of the things that kind of goes into the math of figuring out how frequently do we want to reevaluate these conditions, from a hydrologic standpoint, maybe we want to do it more frequently. From a regulatory standpoint, maybe we don't want to do it that frequently. So I think that would be a balancing act that the department would definitely look for feedback on, and then sort of have to kind of assess what we think is best based on people's feedback. And
which further goes to having a defined time period, because, we can't just at a,
right.
on a daily basis
Right.
be flipping back and forth
right.
between you're in, you're out.
Great. Terry Sue says, I like the idea of deeming recovery in areas where there's ample groundwater supplies available. Maybe we don't need to tie it to storage. Maybe we can define these areas generally and free them of the regulatory constraints. Thanks, Terry Sue. Let's see. We have a comment from Tom Harbour. In my humble opinion, this policy concept seems like a good one, and it should be considered for the Prescott AMA. Great, thank you, Tom. We're certainly interested in hearing from some of the other AMAs and what some of the particular implications might be for those other AMAs. I'm not sure if I have your contact information, but we can find that. Okay, great. Tracy says she does. I would be very interested in hearing more of your thoughts about the Prescott AMA in particular. That'd be great. Thanks. Great. Drew says, this seems to be a large issue for the west side cities due to the Buckeye Waterlogged area. If the desal group did not go forth and recommend the Buckeye Waterlogged area for desal, why recovery? And I think the difference here is really related to considerations around that recharge and recovery, and that this is a little bit more of a focused use of water. This is more focused on the kind of aquifer management aspect of things, where in terms of managing groundwater, it's smart to store water in areas that are experiencing water declines. It's smart to recover water in areas that have shallow groundwater or experiencing rises in water levels. I think it's more of a basic concept kind of like that, rather than what the desal group that was looking at, which was really more of an increase in allowable groundwater uses. So we do see a distinction between those two things.
And I'll just add that we aren't targeting
Fair. Yes.
Right.
Buckeye waterlogged area or any waterlogged area. Our criteria will be developed and applied throughout the AMA or AMAs once it's developed. So, waterlogged areas are named that for a reason. So it's a natural artifact that those areas are going to have the potential to fall into our whatever is determined for the shallow depth of water areas.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. That's a good clarification. Good. Okay, I don't see any additional comments in the chat. I think we've been having a really good discussion up until now. We really do appreciate all of the feedback here. I'm going to pause for just 1 minute to let anybody get any last thoughts in the chat or to unmute themselves and make any comments before we move on and close out the meeting. All right, I see one comment from Gretchen Irwin. Has the department received complaints from any of the providers in the waterlogged area that this is a problem they want to see solved? No, not that we're aware of, I don't think. So I think what we see here is that this is a potential improvement to the program. We're certainly open to whatever feedback is out there. As we've kind of been mentioning, this really is just a proposal at this point, and we're really wanting to hear from you all about the potential for implementation here. Another thing to note here is that we do recognize that we're pretty late in the fifth management plans process here. So if this turns out to be something that needs additional, if this turns out to be something that people see as a good concept, but it needs additional space or time for discussion, it is something we could consider for whatever it is that comes after the fifth management plans, or perhaps we could have additional discussions about this in the post-2025 group. We, the department, are certainly not going to try to force this into a time frame for the fifth management plans if there is additional discussion that may be required here, or if there's additional concerns that come up about this. So, all right, I think we'll go ahead and move on. I have mentioned several times already throughout this meeting how much we appreciate all of the feedback and the engagement in this meeting. Your guys' questions have been really thoughtful. It's been a really good discussion. We appreciate the attention that you're paying to this concept, the feedback that we're receiving on this concept. At this point, I'm just really curious to see how all of this pans out. I think it's an interesting process. I think it's an interesting proposal, and we're certainly looking forward to hearing more from you all about how this may or may not work out. So just to recap a little bit, we do have the written proposal available on our website. We also have a questionnaire for today's meetings. If you've been in our other subgroup meetings, you're familiar with that questionnaire at this point. I think McKenna will drop that link in the chat again for the questionnaire. We're asking that you submit your any responses to that questionnaire by July 28th. So what we, the department, will be doing in the meantime as we wait for those questionnaire responses, we'll continue to have discussions with people. I mentioned even in the course of this meeting a couple additional meetings that we'll have with folks. If additional folks are interested in having those conversations, those side conversations with us, please reach out. You can contact me directly, or you can contact our management plans email at managementplans@azwater.gov. We'd appreciate the feedback through the questionnaire. We will assemble that feedback that we received in the questionnaire, that we will receive in the questionnaire, along with considering all of the discussion that we had today, and from all of that, we'll kind of determine our next steps and decide when an additional meeting would be. I imagine we'll want to have an additional meeting about this. It seems like there's a lot to be kind of discussed and nailed down here if we're going to move forward with this. So we will work through that feedback and provide additional information on future meetings after that questionnaire closes. So again, whoops, let me go to the next slide there. I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that we do have some other upcoming fifth management plans meetings. You can see a couple of those dates on the screen. Those meetings, the Ag and Muni meetings that we have upcoming, are going to be focused on reviewing some of our draft regulatory language for the fifth management plans. So we're really excited to be at this step in the process. We've made a lot of progress on the fifth management plans, and we're excited to be sharing some of that more formal language with you all on the concepts that we've developed. So with that, I'll go ahead and close out. We really, again, appreciate all the time that you've dedicated, not just to this meeting, but to this whole fifth management plans process. We know that it's been a lot of meetings. We know that this has been extensive, but we're in the home stretch, folks. So thank you again for all of your time and attention today. We look forward to talking with some of you and also hearing more of your thoughts through the questionnaire. And before I end, thank you also to the folks here in the room with me, Tracy and Kelly and Jeff. We really appreciate your time and expertise today. So thank you everyone for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.